blurred and obscene. Jean Morel, whose face has always been the color of someone who sleeps with both cautious patriotism and private mercy, produced a bundle of papers he had misfiled. They were, in truth, smuggled receipts and altered registers showing marginal notes. He did not boast or dramatize the theft. He handed the papers to me with the same practical air with which he had returned a mislaid ledger from the printer's shop months earlier. For men like him, the law is a thing to be navigated with humility and with the occasional, deliberate misplacement of a pen. When I rose to speak, which I did not do lightly, Renaud's look was equal parts curiosity and contempt. It is an odd thing to address a tribunal. You need to be candid enough to be believed, but measured enough not to be accused of plotting. I stepped forward and laid a single sheet on the table, a copy of the ledger with our marginal notes that had spread among the populace. What we present is not a denial of justice, I said, and my voice perhaps carried better than I expected because the square fell silent in a way that feels like the tightening of a noose. It is a question of method. If names are lists written by hands that can be moved, then the meaning of those names changes. If you allow that possibility, you allow people to contest the ledger that orders them. The crowd's reaction is difficult to describe. It is a thing that happens in the thin hours between speech and comprehension. A sound rose like a half-breath. I could see eyes shift from suspicion to consideration, as if some of them had thought of loved ones they had named themselves, and now wondered whether their names had once been chosen in some clerk's clean hour. But every concession we made that morning had a cost. Renaud did not fail to notice that the public's doubt could be slowed and hardened into something useful for his case. He called for precise legal procedure, for detailed examinations, for sworn affidavits. In other words, he invited the slow, administrative machinery one uses to secure certainty. We had attacked the ledger as a myth by showing its parts. He responded by saying the parts would be remade into a new myth of legality. I had not expected absolute triumph. Such a sign would have been improbable. What I had hoped for, what I had intended, in the flat ledger way that comes from years of cataloguing, was to open a seam. People who believe something unquestioningly can be given cause to question. That morning we made a seam in the skin of the city's faith. Lucy was returned to the dock after a period of intense cross-examination. Renaud's men produced her earlier caused confession as if to demonstrate the fragility of witness. Tyner's plate-burning admission made him appear culpable of tampering. Men in the crowd shouted for both punishment and mercy. The tribunal is not a place for tidy morality. It is a workshop in which the city's anxieties are hammered into shapes that can be legally described. I felt the blows of some of those hammers, not on my person but on the community I kept with small papers and secret folds. As the hours stretched, a small thing occurred that tipped the scales in the only way it could. A woman in the crowd called out the name of a son, misread on a death list. The man whose name had been called stepped forward and declared he had been elsewhere on the day listed. Others corroborated. The act of naming, that morning, was suddenly shown to be porous. That porosity is dangerous to those who would seize the state's lexicon as a fixed instrument. It is also dangerous for those who believe a new uncertainty will save the many. Renaud, furious, tried to reassert a narrative of necessity of the ledger as the guardian of order. He spoke of sacrifices and of the necessity to keep a young republic from dissolving back into aristocratic chaos. He canoricize violence into necessity with the ease of a man who has stood before tribunals and convinced himself that firm actions preempt cataclysm. Yet even his eloquence that day was lumbered by the counter-testimony, Father Benotit's names of clerks, Tien's plates, Jean Morel's misfiled records, Lucy's marginal sheet. As the late afternoon shadowed, the magistrates retired to deliberate. In such times one sees the true habits of a polity. People pressed forward, clutching our marginal lists like trinkets of salvation or proof. Some threw up hands and demanded harsher measures. Others walked away with the look of people who have glimpsed a seam and now carry that image like a small ember under clothing. I remember standing by the bookshop's window later, after the tribunal had adjourned into a fog of official statements and threatened appeals. The city outside moved as it always did, but it had new gestures, hands that instantly flipped open a binding, eyes that traced margins for notes where there had been none. The habit of looking had changed, slightly but irrevocably. What we claimed that day was not a complete unmaking of the tribunal's power. Laws rustle into new shapes slowly. Wheels of state do not stop because the public coughs. Yet our work had a different measure. If a single list could be shown to be forged, if plates could be burned and clerks coaxed into naming by habit and pressure, then certainty had a weakness. The machinery of judgment relies not simply on law, but on the people's willing acceptance of its readings. We did not topple the machine. We scuffed its paint and showed the gears beneath. In the end, the tribunal issued a cautious verdict. Some names were delayed, some processes reviewed, and a number of cases re-examined. They called this a victory for due process. Renaud called it a clarification. For us it was not a clean victory, and it was not an unmitigated defeat. Lucy, cursed with the luck of the visibly brave, was given an ambiguous sentence, a period of public labor, perhaps intended as humiliation, perhaps as a means to end the fever she had stoked. Tyne was fined and warned of further breach. Jean Morel received a rebuke couched in formal law. Father Binot was complained against by the more zealous civic mouthpieces and yet not removed. The state was wary of making a martyr for conscience. The people who had been named and then unnamed returned to halves of lives, not wholly restored and not wholly lost. That night, in the dim space behind my counter, where the lamplight collects in the dust like a small, hovering congregation, I set down the ledger we had used as evidence and opened another book. I write lists in private because lists in public are the instruments of the state. Lists in private are the measure by which I tend love and debt and the small accounts of daily life. I wrote the names of those who had helped us that day in a margin with quick, unadorned strokes. Tyne, for his burned conscience. Lucy, for her voiced reading. Jean, for his misfiled mercy. Father Binot for his reticent courage. Madeleine for her Salon's double-edged hopes. And there was my name in the ledger we had paraded that afternoon, still present as if to remind me that name's perseverance in other people's hands. I had expected fear to have a single color, but fear is many-hued. That night it tasted of iron and cedar and the small sweetness of a page turned in a new book. I suppose that is what it means to be a bookseller beneath the guillotine. You learn that documents can be both rope and lifeline. You learn that a communal act of reading can become a communal act of choice. We had made no revolution at the tribunal steps. We had only shown that the instruments of fate could be pried open, if only by the patient hands of those who know how to read the margins. When I went to bed, my ledger lay beneath my pillow as it always did, the practice of my life. I counted the day's events the way I might inventory a poor stockroom, an overcount here, and a mission there, and a few pieces that will never be accounted for. Outside, somewhere in the city, a man named that day may have an hour less of sleep. A woman may fold a handkerchief over a secret and feel, for the first time, the itch of knowledge that will not be cured by silence. The measure of things is not always in verdicts. It is sometimes in the small habits that persist. I had not set out to be a judge. I had set out to be a keeper of books, yet that keeping had become a politics. There are times when even keeping is a kind of naming. The ledger's monopoly on names had been fractured, and with that fracture came both danger and a sliver of possibility. We ended the day with no promises but one, that people would begin to look. They would run their fingers down bindings, glance at margins, learn that the apparatus that names them is not a vast, immovable object, but a collection of men and clerks and presses that can be seen and altered. Whether those alterations will save lives will be decided in the dull, long hours to come. As I close this account, I do not know whether the next time a name falls from a blade it will be because fate was written, or because someone had a better ledger. I only know that the city's belief in the ledger has been scored. Doubt has entered like a small, stubborn plant through a seam in old wood. It will not overthrow the guillotine overnight, but the act of measuring has changed. Men will now ask who measured, who recorded, who pressed type in the night. They will whisper, they will look. That, for now, is all the victory I can count. And when the next list is read, perhaps if we are both clever and cruel enough, we will have between us a margin in which to write a different name. The question remains open as ink on a knife-edged page. Will the crowd choose belief once more, or will it, this time, name itself? I have always measured the day by small reckonings, the number of books that pass my counter, the exact angle at which light gathers on a spine, the weight of 2 coins clipped into a palm. The city, for a long while, had taught me to count differently, by the number of steps toward the place where justice is made manifest, by the rhythm of the drums that announce a procession, by the hush that falls when a name has been taken from its bed and set in the tribunal's ledger. Then a book came to me with no hand attached to it, and my measures turned inward. Now I measure by marginalia. There are things that happen after a drama that no one writes playbills for. The air settles. The squares unclench. People go back to standing in line for bread and to arguing over whether the new slogan has more truth in it than the old song. The guillotine returns to being a punctuation mark rather than a paragraph. Its upright wood becomes a part of the street furniture, a presence that can be seen and, because of that, named and thus, perhaps, contested. If there is a lesson late in this book, it is a small one and not fit for banners, that to teach a people to read is not only to hand them alphabets, but also to give them the tools to suspect the way alphabets have been strung together. The ledger taught us one alphabet. Our response has been to learn the other, the marginal one. Where the tribunal wrote names in a single, authoritative hand, we wrote in the margins. Where the administration used lists to fix the world, we inserted notes that pointed out joints and hinges. Not all of these notes were truth. Some were deliberate untruths, and some were pedagogy in disguise. Tyne called it an apprenticeship. Type makes truth only if you let it, he said once, the words coming through a grin tight with tiredness. He had burned type. It is a strange thing to describe, the sound and smell of letters going to flame. The sound is less the crackle of paper than the small, metallic sigh of something that has had duty laid upon it and is relieved. The smell is iron and the faint perfume of old glue. Tyne set plates in the chimney because a press is an altar, and he had learned to sacrifice the tools which made him complicit. From those ashes he fashioned forgery fast enough to look indistinguishable from fact. We spread those forgeries in the places where the ledger's ink had made its home, the hands of the hawkers, the covers of cheap catechisms, and the seams of the books that people thought themselves safe to open at home. The first marginal note I wrote was not clever. It was a single sentence in a book of household remedies, tucked between a recipe for salve and a letter on obstetrics. Look for the clerk with the mole on his left hand. It was a direction that might lead to a man or might lead to nothing at all. It was pedagogy in a slipper. When Hortense found that book in a laundry bundle and told me, breathless and suspicious, that she had asked for the clerk and found a different man entirely, laughter came out of me like a breath I had been holding. People have a hunger for exactness even when exactness kills them. Sometimes it is enough to teach them to mistrust it. Father Bino T called it an act of piety. He kept a room under the chapel not for the saints but for the stubborn things that made us human. His archive smelled of wax, of vellum, and of damp stone. There were ruled volumes where names were crossed in ink of many colors, some crossed for punishment. Some crossed because a clerical hand had decided the best place to put them was not this ledger but another. If a name is a command, he said softly, arranging papers under a lamp, then a marginal note is a question. He taught me how to fold a page, so the margin would hide a sliver of text that could be opened like an aperture by the reader. He taught me that the practice of doubt could be taught as if it were a craft, a stitch here, a hidden pasteboard there. People who never thought themselves conspirators became readers who knew where to look. Lucy, who once spoke like a bell, learned to write like a key. Her letters were small and urgent. She left them in the cheap school books of the daughters of laundresses, in catechisms that would be taken to confession by old women who still believed in the salvific power of a good story. Write it as if you owe it to the child who will read after you, she told me. She became, in time, the one who taught the habit. It is strange to see the young become the medium for a caution they no longer fear. Her bravery made our marginalia less a prank and more an instruction manual. There were rules we gave ourselves. Never write in a book that would not be read. Never write in a book that is known to the tribunal's clerks as inventory. Never put blame in a margin that could be traced to a vulnerable person. We learned the art of what to leave blank as carefully as what to fill. One of the most useful tactics was the insertion of plausible ambiguity. A reader who found a margin note that prompted a question rather than an answer would, by habit, begin asking more questions. A single scratched note. Did you notice how often the ledger's first column matches the names of the council's creditors? Might not topple a court, but it would teach a reader to cross-reference. That habit is quietly infectious. Madeline thought like a salon hostess and acted like a chess player. She introduced the notion that gossip could be a directed traffic. A laugh, a dropped handkerchief, a hymn brushed at a particular moment, all these were signals to be passed. When she said the ledger's lists had the cadence of sermon and the certainty of scripture, people listened because they liked the idea of hidden liars in the salons. She taught the women who still managed households to embed meaning in mannered talk. That kind of social literacy is no less powerful than the notches we made in paper. You do not teach a city to mistrust a ledger without risk. Renaud tightened his pocketbooks and drew lines where they did not exist. He watched the printers more closely. He ordered inventories of all municipal records. And he employed men whose job was to look for marginalia with the same attention a naturalist gives to beetles on a branch. Jean Morel, an honest man with a soldier's reluctance to be cruel, filed things wrong, misplaced warrants, and in one notable office hour pushed a petition toward a stove where a clerk burned it as if it were private warmth. Little mercies are the mechanism of resistance where blunt force cannot be used. But mercies do not scale. They are episodic and depend on the human faintness in others. There were also betrayals. Lucy's capture was a wound whose edges we learned to press. She had been held and questioned. The tribunal poured sugar over her words to test their viscosity. She confessed to what she thought would be believed, and to the things she could not bear to keep from the men who held her. She named names to stop pain, and yet she also crossed places that could not be easily undone. In the ensuing months, the confession was a fossil of sorts. It hardened, got rubbed in clerks' hands, and was presented in public as proof of a conspiracy of booksellers. Against that hard, public narrative we mounted our small, private pedagogy. Tiny's sacrifice was not merely technical. The press is a thing that holds memory and, at the same time, reproduces it. When he fed plates to the fire, he was not erasing evidence so much as making a different kind of evidence. The counterfeit lists he manufactured from memory and burned type lent plausibility to misdirection. I have watched him crouched by the chimney, cleaning the soot from the corners of his mouth, and thought of the strange way guilt and resolution share a shape. He turned his trade into a weapon and then into an offering. The people he saved may not have known his name. He did not require them to. There is a peculiar cruelty in the way a ledger can be undone. The tribunal relies on spectacle and on certainty. Remove certainty and spectacle loses its cut. Our marginalia were designed to produce the slow rot of meaning. We inserted contradictions, 2 lists for the same day, one with a baker's name and another with a bailiff's. Annotations that suggested that names had been rearranged according to debt. Notes that implied that the tribunal's clerks were as human as anyone and were paid into error. The city learned, inch by cautious inch, to ask where a name had come from and who had an interest in its being there. The square that day after the steps had been confronted looked at once emptied and full. People came to see whether truth could be argued into being. Men and women clutched coal-black pamphlets we had given them, some containing forgery, some containing instructions on how to fold a page so the margin would catch the light. Bastien ran through crowds like a rumor. I saw faces I had known for years and some I had only just learned to trust. The guillotine stood like an indifferent tree. The crowds gathered around it as if expecting a sermon or a miracle. It did not give either, but what it gave was worse for some, doubt. Renaud's face was a ledger in itself, a tally not yet balanced. He barked and ordered and wrote. He tried to read our marginalia as if they were annotations in his own book. He did not, or could not, perceive that the most dangerous notes were those that did not claim a single truth, but taught the reader to be skeptical. If you can teach 100 people to mistrust a single list, that list becomes a less effective instrument of power. If you can teach 1,000, the list has to be tested in 1,000 courts. What we did was not heroism as it is told in the pulpits. It was bookkeeping of another sort. I took books and made them into maps of doubt. In the binding of a child's primer, I hid a folded sheet that described how to check the parish register for entries that contradicted a ledger's list. In a theology treatise, I added a footnote that suggested the reader inquire of the executioner's journeyman about the order in which names were announced. Father Bino T. wrote poetic marginalia, small prayers that suggested, without saying directly, that the reader think for themselves. Madeleine placed a small slip in the sleeve of an expensive novel that read, "Simply name yourself." Twice. There is a certain humility to marginalia. They expect nothing grand. They do not promise salvation. They ask a question and trust that the person who finds it will take a step. The steps are tiny. A laundress who reads a note and then asks a neighbor to keep a list of surnames can, by simple arithmetic, produce confusion sufficient to stall a single procession. A clerk who is taught to look at ledgers with suspicion may file a name where it cannot be found. Small things accumulate into a culture of reading that is skeptical by habit, and yet there is cost. The tribunal punished approximations of rebellion even when nothing more than a note had been found. People were arrested for possessing altered books. Some were executed on spurious grounds. Our marginalia could not save them all. I do not tell this story to make martyrdom into a spectacle. I tell it because the real measure of our work was not the lives it saved singly, though some were saved, but the habit it left behind. You may want to know what became of me. I could tell you with the comfort of certainty, but I have learned to speak precisely because I distrust the comforts of certainty. The shop was searched. Renaud's men moved through the rooms with the efficient appetite of clerks at a ledger, opening boxes, tapping bindings, and letting their fingers judge which book might crack under their attention. They missed a good many things. Perhaps it was carelessness. Perhaps it was the exhaustion of being asked to make meaning of a city all day. In the false bottom of the trunk under my counter, they found a conspicuous ledger that had been planted. My heart beats a little faster, remembering the look on the commissaire's face when he thought he had my confession in ink. What they did not find was the cassette of small folded notes hidden within the gutters of another dozen books, nor the tiny instructions sewn into the hems of a child's primer. In the days that followed, Renaud paraded the conspicuous ledger he had found as evidence. He read from it like a man reading scripture. He hoped to bring me to him with the simplicity of an assertion. I had made lists, and therefore I was the list maker, the author of death. The crowd responded with the divided thing crowds do. Some shouted for my head with the old, comforting certainty. Others, taught now to ask, shouted back different things entirely. It was in that clash that something irrecoverable happened. The ledger's authoritativeness faltered, because it no longer spoke as the only voice. It spoke into a chorus. I stood on the steps that day and tried to say what a ledger is. A ledger is a method, I said, my voice steady as if I had spoken these syllables to myself 1,000 times, and they had become a kind of prayer. It is paper and hand and administration, it is not a god. The words landed like stones into a river. Some skipped, some sank. Lucy had been freed by a plan too messy to tell here, and she moved through the crowd handing out clean sheets with a single sentence. You may strike a name from the list if you can show that it was put there for reasons of debt or spite or order. It was clumsy and beautiful. What followed was not a revolution, but a redistribution of doubt. People began to ask clerks for copies of lists. They cross-checked parish records. They looked for mismatches. The tribunal moved to secure its ledgers. The press of the city became more circumspect. We did not throw Renaud from his office. We did not topple the guillotine. But we taught some people to read differently, and that is tedious and enduring work. A skeptical habit is not spectacular, but it is pernicious to an authority that relies on the seamlessness of belief. There are traces left in the city even now, marginals in the bindings of prayer books where, if you turn the page and hold it to the light, you can read a hand like mine instructing a reader to count every secretary's signature across 3 months. There are primers with small stitches that hide a folded paper saying, if you are to be named, choose the name you will answer to. There are in Father Benot's archive volumes annotated by penitents who learn to register their own reckonings. Those traces are not monuments, they are seeds. If you come to my shop now, a small, sun-scarred place under the eaves, you will find it quiet. Shelves breathe. There are still false bottoms and the scent of glue. You may find a book by an anonymous hand in which the margin reads, when they ask your name, tell them the name of the person who taught you to be suspicious. If you peel that note open, you will find a smaller note beneath it written in a child's hand that says, simply, name me again. What becomes of the names written in the tribunal's ledger is a slow process. Some remain stubborn as scars. Others are peeled away by cross-checks and by gawks of clerical error. A few are blanked by acts of mercy or by the simple fact of human forgetfulness. The culture we made the practice of questioning, annotating, and hiding does not reverse everything. It does not make the city gentle, but it makes it porous. I cannot promise you a tidy ending. There is no tidy ending. If I were to finish with the flourish of certainty, I would be committing the very thing I have spent these pages resisting. The temptation to write the ending as if fate had single authorship. The ledger may name me, it may not. The tribunal may have reason enough to make my name appear on a list and to set a date. Or I may have taken measures to conceal myself in a code of bindings and become another clerk's rumor. Perhaps I sit now at my counter while you read and feel the draft of the street across my shoulders. Perhaps the bookshop is shuttered and the roof rats know the cadence of voices that once bent over a table. The truth is that the bookshop exists in the ways people remember to look in the seams of things. There is, before I close, one last instruction I have left in a volume that I know will not be destroyed easily. When you find a name in a ledger, write in the margin who wrote it, who profited from it, and who might have wished it there. Fold that sheet and place it where a curious child may find it later. Teach that child the habit of counting reasons. Teach them the arithmetic of names. It is not a formula to stop a blade in every instance. It is not a talisman against every accusation. It is, rather, a practice that makes it harder for a single hand to take a name and make it law. And if the question you ask is whether I die under the blade, I will answer with another marginalia. Read how the ledger trembles when many hands touch it. The book stops here for you to turn the page and find what you will evidence, absence, or a further folded note. If you are merciful, you will choose to leave a note of your own. I tuck the last folded paper into a binding and close the cover. The attic light fades in the gutters. Somewhere outside, a bell strikes the hour and the city shifts its shape. The guillotine waits like punctuation, patient and indifferent. The lesson waits like a hinge. The hands that know how to write in the margins are the hands that will, in time, teach others to see. There is one thing I will tell you plainly. Names are not fate until we have agreed that they are. If you learn to unwrite them, you will have learned the only revolution that begins without banners. And now if you have the courage to look, you will find beneath the third shelf from the window, behind a volume of sermons, a ribboned slip. It says, in a hurried child's hand, if you need a name to save you, write a new one. Beyond that, the story does not yet end. It waits for a hand to open the book and either obey or defy. The margin is patient. The next sentence is yours.